The Aswang of Iloilo, a tale from the 1920s and the war years. In the 1920s, the small barrio of Pandan, Iloilo, nestled in the rolling hills and expansive rice fields of the western Visayas, was a place of peaceful routines, where the scent of freshly harvested rice hung in the air, and the sun painted the sky with hues of gold and crimson at dusk. For the people who lived there, the world seemed far from the troubles of the outside, but the peace of the island, though beautiful, was fragile, haunted by the shadow of old stories and ancient fears. I never met my grandmother's mother, but I remember her voice, soft yet steady, recounting the stories that had been handed down through generations. Every now and then, in the quiet of our home, she would lean forward, her weathered hands resting on the old wooden table, her eyes distant as if looking into a past too dark to forget. "The Aswang," she would start, pausing as though considering how to choose her words, "are not just stories to scare children. They are warnings, warnings about the things that hide in the shadows, things that come for those who stray too far from the safety of the light." I remember the chills that would run through me at the mention of the Aswang, those supernatural beings of Filipino folklore, creatures of darkness, hunger, and malice. But these weren't just tales, they were truths, at least in my grandmother's eyes. The first encounters in the 1920s. In the early 1920s, when my grandmother was just a child, the people of Pandan had lived in constant fear of these creatures, particularly the Aswang, which were known to be shapeshifters able to take on the guise of harmless animals or even fellow villagers. Some said the Aswang took the form of a large, bat-like creature, swooping down to feast on its prey, while others told of creatures with sharp teeth and claws that would drain the life from the living. But most frightening of all were the rumors of the Aswang that could steal babies from their mother's womb, a horror that left women terrified and vigilantly guarding their children. One night, a woman named Lita, my grandmother recounted, was sitting on her front porch, humming a lullaby to her newborn son. The wind was still, the stars bright, and for a moment, all seemed calm. But then she heard the soft rustling of leaves. It was so faint, she thought it was just the wind. She rose from her rocking chair to check on her baby, and saw nothing. No creature, no shadow. But when she turned back to the cradle, her son was gone. My grandmother would pause for a moment, her face heavy with the weight of the memory. Lita searched for days. The town turned out in full force, combing the forest and fields, but there was no trace of the baby. The only thing they found was a blood-stained cloth near the creek, and the baby was never seen again. The villagers, their hearts heavy with sorrow and fear, turned to the elders for guidance. They were told to stay indoors after sunset, to lock their doors and windows, and to keep an eye on the children. The old stories of the Aswang became more than folklore, they became survival tactics. They began to leave bowls of garlic at the doorways and smear the blood of animals on their thresholds, in hopes of warding off the creatures of the night. Rising fear as the war approached, but as the 1930s drew closer, the winds of war began to stir in the world. The Philippines, still a colony of the United States, had not yet felt the full weight of the global conflict, but tensions were rising, and with the rising tensions came a different kind of darkness. The Aswang, it seemed, were not the only creatures to fear. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, whispers began to spread about the approaching Japanese forces. The people of Iloilo, like the rest of the Philippines, would soon feel the impact of the invasion. War brought with it a different kind of monster, one that was far more real than any supernatural creature. The Japanese soldiers, ruthless and unyielding, marched through towns and villages, leaving devastation in their wake. My grandmother would speak of these times with a mix of sorrow and bitterness. "I remember the first time I saw them," she said, her voice trembling. "The Japanese soldiers arrived in our town, marching with their rifles, their faces stern and unfeeling. They didn't come to help, they came to destroy. The invasion was swift, and the atrocities committed by the Japanese soldiers were far worse than any of the legends of the Aswang. They burned homes, raided villages, and killed anyone who resisted. Many of the townsfolk fled into the mountains, hoping to escape the bloodshed, while others joined the local guerrilla fighters to take up arms against the invaders. But even in these remote hills, the terror was not confined to the soldiers. The Aswang seemed to sense the fear in the air, their presence growing stronger as the people's lives became filled with more and more suffering. The Aswang during the Japanese occupation. As the war dragged on, my grandmother's family was forced to flee their home in Pandan. They moved to a small, hidden village in the mountains, hoping to evade the Japanese forces. It was there, in the isolation of the hills, that the true horrors of the war began to manifest, not just in the form of soldiers, but also in the creatures that lurked in the night. The Aswang, hungry from years of feeding on the fear of the people, seemed to grow stronger. My grandmother's voice dropped to a whisper as she recounted the events of one particular night. It was a moonless evening, and the air was thick with tension. The soldiers had just raided a nearby village, and we were all afraid. We knew that they would come for us next. That night, as the villagers huddled together in their makeshift homes, a strange noise pierced the silence. It began as a soft scratching sound at the door, then grew louder, more insistent. A woman named Tita Rosa, who had recently lost her husband to the Japanese soldiers, was the first to hear it. She went to the door, heart pounding, and looked out into the night. "Rosa," my grandmother had warned, "don't open the door." But it was too late. The door creaked open, and standing in the moonless dark was a figure, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over bone. He was covered in what looked like soot, his hands outstretched. Tita Rosa gasped. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, he let out a low, guttural growl, and his form shifted before her eyes. In a blink, he was no longer a man, but a creature with wings, sharp talons, and an unholy hunger in its eyes. It was an Aswang. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged at Tita Rosa, knocking her to the ground. The others rushed to help, but the Aswang moved with unnatural speed, slashing and clawing at anything in its path. It was only when the villagers held up their crosses and garlic that the creature recoiled and fled into the night, leaving behind only a trail of blood and terror. Tita Rosa was never seen again. The blurring of monsters, human and supernatural. In the days that followed, my grandmother began to notice a disturbing pattern. People would disappear, and no one could explain how. At first, they thought the Aswang were responsible, taking their victims in the night. But over time, it became clear that the true horror was something more insidious. The Japanese soldiers, whose raids had devastated the area, began to take advantage of the fear and confusion. They would strike at night, using the Aswang stories to cover their tracks. The line between human cruelty and supernatural horror blurred, and the villagers didn't know who to fear anymore. Sometimes, my grandmother would say, her eyes glistening with unspoken sorrow, we would hear the sound of soldiers marching, and we would think it was the Aswang. But when we went to investigate, there would be nothing. And then, the next day, we would find bodies brutalized, mutilated, drained of life. It was as if the soldiers were hunting us like prey, just as the Aswang did. The villagers no longer knew what was real and what was born of their fears. Were the Aswang the true threat, or had the war created monsters far worse than anything in the old stories? the lasting legacy of the Aswang. When the war finally ended, and the Japanese left the Philippines, the people of Iloilo returned to their villages, broken and weary. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, remained, but the Aswang, though still whispered about in the dark, were no longer the greatest threat. The true monsters had been human, the soldiers who had wreaked havoc on their homes and families. But even after the war, the fear didn't leave. My grandmother often spoke of the quiet nights, when she would hear the scratching at the door, or the distant sound of wings flapping in the night. She would tell me that the Aswang were still out there, waiting, feeding on the lingering fears of the people.